We are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the adoption of the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. So I brought them. This is the text we celebrate. And when they were adopted 40 years ago, they were seen as a landmark in the development of the law, in the codification of the law, but also in the universalization process of the law. And actually, they are still a very interesting document to read. We will be talking about it, but I also invite you to have a look, because they remain a very rich document, very interesting to read. And it's a key document when you study international maritime law. Since then, we've seen major progress in the field of international maritime law through different treaties, progress in international justice, but yet we cannot be only positive. We see also massive violations of the law in modern conflicts. And we have mixed feelings when celebrating such an anniversary. So at the time, we were discussing a lot about guerrilla. Today, we discuss a lot about terror and counter-terror. Does the law still apply to these situations? At the time, the aim was to protect better the civilians. And still today, we see siege warfare, attacks against civilian population. So is there a problem with the implementation of the law? How can we make it respected in the field? At the time also, we were looking at new technologies, and you know how fast they develop. So today we are talking a lot about cyber warfare. There is today a conference organized by the ITU on artificial intelligence in Geneva and the risks that it can pose. So these are questions which were there in 1977, which may have evolved and changed. So we need to look at how the law can still address it. Do we need to look at it with a new perspective? Are we living in such a different times that it needs a revision? Or on the contrary, can we say that life starts at 40? Have you heard that? So that's maybe what we want to discuss now. Let's look at these texts and let's see if they cannot be very relevant to the situations we have today. So what does the law say? Does it work? How can we convince parties to abide by it? How can we also have more states ratify these treaties? These are the questions that we'll be discussing this evening. So, our panelists will address these questions from their respective standpoints. And I will try to capture the main question. What is the relevance of the additional protocols today in tackling the challenges of the modern battlefield? So we'll start with Yves Sandeau. And as I won't list all your merits, Yves, we have distributed this leaflet where you will find a resume of our panelists. So I won't introduce them. You can know more about their profiles looking at this leaflet. And at the back, you can also find the link to our newsletter to follow our next events. So Yves Sandeau, who is an honorary member of the International Committee of the Red Cross, was present during the negotiations, and his task today is to give an account of the context, the challenges faced at the time, the achievements, what the additional protocols brought at the time. Then we will give the floor to Hélène Obregon-Gizeken, who is a thematic lawyer here at the ICRC, and then she will jump also in time, and we'll discuss about the challenges that the ICRC face today in the implementation of the additional protocols. How does the ICRC use the additional protocols in its work? How it makes a difference in the field. Then we have the pleasure to welcome Frank Ledwidge, who came especially from London. So thanks a lot, Frank, for coming. So Frank is a lecturer at the Royal Air Force College, but he had previous lives. And he will give us a military perspective. He has extensive military operations. He's also a barrister. So he combines this experience in teaching the law, in field operations, the military, and also the law. So it will be a very interesting perspective on the additional protocols. And last but not least, we'll have the perspective of a representative of a state party. Jonathan Quenu is a good friend and is also legal advisor at the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Switzerland has been very active in the promotion of the additional protocols and continues to be. So Jonathan will give us this perspective from a state on the additional protocols. So thank you very much, and now let's start the conversation with Yves.
No, for me, the real question is if the life starts at 70, not at 40. But my first keyword would be nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, why? Because you had Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, who were the culminating point of the massive bombing of cities, which took place through all the Second World War. And in fact, also during that war, the fact that the rules containing moderate the conduct of hostilities were very poorly observed. So there was a necessity also in 1949 to reaffirm and to develop those rules. But the negotiators were prevented to do that precisely also because of nuclear weapons. Because the Americans had the monopoly of nuclear weapons. They had a big strategic advantage having this monopoly, and they didn't want to discuss the question of nuclear weapons. But other countries didn't want to enter discussion on the conduct of hostilities without discussing also nuclear weapons. It was a deadlock. And the years after, when we had other nuclear power, this deadlock continued because the other nuclear power, the majority of them at least, were also thinking that to have an interdiction of nuclear weapons would jeopardize, in fact, the credibility of the deterrence policy based on the possession of nuclear weapons. And this deadlock continued, but in between, very cruel war developed as well, and the necessity of reaffirming and developing rules of conduct of hostilities was always more pressing. And finally, a way out could be found by pushing aside this question of nuclear weapons in the disarmament framework, with all the mass destructive weapons. With the argument, it's a good argument, that when you discuss those weapons, you cannot discuss only the use, which is an EHL method, but you have also to discuss their manufacturing, transfer, destruction, and so on. So finally, they could find this solution, and the door was open to discuss the question of the conduct of hostilities provision in the framework of EHL. But in 1974, when the conference opened, the situation, political situation, world political situation was difficult. There was the midst of Cold War. The Vietnam War was not yet finished. The decolonization process was also not yet finished. And at the first session, there was purely political discussion, without any progress, just especially on the participation of Vietnam. As you know, this participation issue is very delicate all the time, with the Red Cross Conference too. We had South Africa, we had the ex-Yugoslavia, we had the Palestine participation question, which blocked conferences. Then it was Vietnam conference. At the end of the first session, some delegates said we have to give up. It's not possible to go through. We'll never succeed in having this conference. And the strong determination of Swiss government and of the ICRC finally convinced the delegate to go on. And they could finally find solution. The second, third, and fourth session of the conference could finally discuss substantial issues. The negotiation started not only on the question of the conduct of hostilities, with difficult questions like the question of reprisal, for example. I will not enter into details. But also of new problems, because in 1974 we had new states emerging from the decolonization process, and they had also some questions they wanted to be raised in the conference. And they obtained something on the mercenary, particularly the fact that mercenary cannot have the status of prisoners of war. But 2 points were extremely delicate. 2 points were extremely delicate because they touch the foundation and essence of humanitarian law. The first one was the question of war of liberation. Because they require to have more rights and less duties for the liberation movement fighting against colonial power. And that would touch the basic question of having equal rights and duties for all belligerents in humanitarian law. That will be the end of humanitarian law if you don't keep this equal right and duty for all parties. And finally, a solution could be found. We keep the right and duty, equal right and duties for all belligerents, but you upgrade the liberation war, which are international war, with the application of all humanitarian law, and in particular the status of prisoners of war for most parties. The second very delicate issue was the question of guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla, it's like Mao, famous Mao quotation, guerrilla is in the civilian population like a fish in the water. And as you know, humanitarian is based on the principle of distinction, civilian and military and so on. What solution to be found? There also a compromise theory was found, the fact that guerrilla could be in the civilian population, but they carry on openly when fighting. Which means practically they don't fail to have a protected status, civilian or wounded person, and make an act of hostility. That's forbidden, that's a limit. And this compromise was finally agreed upon and by that. Now, why this conference could be finally successful with such a delicate issue? Well, I would speak in a few words of the atmosphere of the conference, in the conference. First, you had great personalities. Certainly the guerrilla compromise was mainly due to a remarkable American delegate, George Aldrich, who negotiated that finally and could find this solution. Liberation war was also greatly accepted through the personality of George Abissab, that many of you know. It's an Egyptian delegate, but is professor of international law here in Geneva, who found this solution of upgrading the liberation war. And you had also generally, Grishenko, the Russian Nachlik, the Polish, Bote, the German, all great personality, and also a certain improvement of the atmosphere in the conference. You know, before, that's a lesson we really to take into account. Beyond delegation, we have delegates. Beyond delegation, we have persons. And persons who can try, have some discussion. And they more and more became, if not friends, at least much more closer of each other. You have also the Stanwell Institute. Michel Bote is there, the vice president of the institute, which was created at this moment and organized roundtable between the sessions, which allowed some discussion between the delegates. And we have a certain atmosphere, a sense of humor in the conference, which developed in the conference. I'll give you just two anecdotes. What is the time now? We're strict with the time. No, it's still two anecdotes. One, you know, in the Goscinny comics, very famous Goscinny comics, you have a character which is no good. Is no good, the Grand Vizier of Baghdad. And Isnogud was the nickname of the Iraqi delegate, not because he was the Grand Vizier of Baghdad, because when we were negotiating compromise and finding finally solution, because all was negotiated by consensus, he always raised his hand and said, it's not good, it's not good. It was not good, and so we had to renegotiate. So finally he had the nickname of it's not good, because it's not. The other one is the French delegate in the drafting committee who told, no, pour le français, c'est évidemment la délégation française qui a le dernier mot. And the Algerian delegate mentioned that, you know, Mr. Delegate, when I was a child in Algeria, I had a book of history, a professor of history, who told me that I have to speak of mes ancêtres les Gaulois. So I have also something to say of the French version of the protocol. Just to say that atmospheric conference was also an atmosphere of friendship, of joy. And finally, I would say, and that's certainly something which allowed this achievement, because it's an achievement, this protocol, and I will finish by that, it's a great achievement. The fact to have adopted those protocols in 1977, in an atmosphere very tense in the world, was already a great success. The conduct of hostilities rules were finally a great progress also, no doubt. The Protocol 2, development of rules on non-international armed conflict, is certainly something which is a great success. But not only that, you had, don't forget, you had dual missing. You had in the convention the principle, and that's very important, the principle that the family have the right to know the fate of their relatives. That's something very important. In the law of action, you have also a kind of principle of solidarity which was introduced with the relief action have to be undertaken, shall be undertaken when necessary. And that's certainly a kind of injection of principle of solidarity inside the humanitarian law, which is very important. We have also child soldier and the fact that medical aircraft could, through identification means, fly again. So we had a lot of progress. It's not perfect, of course. Additional Protocol 2 was reduced at the end, as you know. You have some provision which was not very clear. And there was some work done afterwards. But I think we have to keep in mind that it was an extraordinary diplomatic success in the political context of the time. And I would say, and finish by that, I would even say it saved humanitarian law. Because you have two dangers. You have the danger to accept rules which would jeopardize the idea of humanitarian law, the question of equality of management, or the question of having no distinction between the combatant and civilian. That would be. But not to find a compromise on that would have been the end of the universality of humanitarian law. So humanitarian law was kept alive, and its universality as well. So I think it was really a great achievement. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for giving us the meaning of this adoption of this great achievement, including the behind-the-scene version of the negotiations. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Helen to go on and look at the subsequent history and the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be here today to mark the anniversary of the 1977 additional protocols and the impact they have had on the way armed conflicts are fought. As we have just heard, 40 years ago, the protocols codified basic principles and rules of international humanitarian law, IHL. They also developed new rules to reflect the changing face of modern conflicts. These contributions still stand at the front line, helping to protect civilians from the worst excesses of war and guiding parties as they navigate new realities. In the following remarks, I would first like to highlight some of the protocol's key achievements since their adoption, and then set out their vital and continued relevance today. When considering some of the concrete successes of the protocols over the last decades, it is important to recall first that they are among the most widely ratified or acceded to international instruments, with 174 states parties to Protocol 1 and 168 to Protocol 2. Together with the 1949 Geneva Conventions, they form the foundations of IHL and are cornerstones for the protection and respect of human dignity in armed conflict. Unlike the conventions, however, the protocols are not universally ratified. On this 40th anniversary, the ICRC would first like to invite states not yet party to adhere to the protocols as an important step to improve the protection of persons affected by armed conflicts worldwide. The protocols have also catalyzed the development of international law. For instance, by inspiring the elaboration of multiple weapons treaties and establishing the groundwork for them. During the 1974-1977 diplomatic conference, as was just mentioned, delegates recommended the convening of a special UN conference to work on what ultimately became the 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. The principles and rules set out in the additional protocols also underlie the 1997 treaty banning anti-personnel mines and the 2008 treaty prohibiting cluster munitions. These treaties have all contributed to reducing the pain and suffering of victims of war every year. Yet another milestone contribution of the protocols was to the fight against impunity. Additional Protocol 1 expanded the list of grave breaches of IHL in international armed conflicts. Meanwhile, Protocol 2 blazed a trail for international criminal law in non-international armed conflicts. Although Protocol 2 does not stipulate individual criminal responsibility for serious violations of IHL, in 1994, the Security Council considered that this was implicit in the obligations the protocol established. It gave the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda jurisdiction over such violations. 1 year later, the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia held that individual criminal responsibility existed in respect of violations of the customary law of internal conflicts. Today, the statute of the International Criminal Court contains a detailed list of serious violations in both types of conflicts. In addition, many states have adopted laws and taken effective measures to prevent and punish serious violations of IHL committed in these conflicts. Finally, and perhaps most concretely, the real triumph of the additional protocols has been their ability to translate in practice. The last 40 years have proven that, far from ivory tower idealism, they are battle-worn tools that make a tangible difference on the ground. I would like to share just 2 examples of this and how the protocols work in action. As peace was negotiated in Colombia at the close of last year, the final agreement between the state and the FARC and the subsequent amnesty law largely drew from Article 6.5 of Additional Protocol 2. This is a clear example of national integration of the widest possible amnesty recommended by the protocol for persons who merely participated in hostilities. This experience may serve to inform other peace processes when assessing how transitional justice can facilitate the road to peace. The prospect of using amnesties in the future is also a strong and perhaps the most persuasive incentive for combatants in other conflicts to comply with international humanitarian law. A second example is the frequent improvement of the conduct of hostilities as armed forces work to apply the law in their targeting, an issue that Frank will touch upon as well. For example, many military manuals, including those of states not or not at the time party to Protocol 1, lay down the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions. In addition, a number of states are trying to use more precise weapons to reduce civilian casualties in line with IHL. Before closing, I would like to briefly address the continued relevance of the protocols today. Today, we often hear 3 main concerns about IHL. 1, it is not adequate to the nature of armed conflicts. 2, it is not applicable in the context of fighting terrorism. And 3, it imposes unfair symmetric obligations on parties in asymmetric conflicts. These should not be mistaken as new. In fact, the existing challenges to IHL, including the increase in internal armed conflicts, rapid advances of modern technologies, asymmetric conflicts, and terrorism are precisely issues that the protocol sought to address. In this light, efforts to dismiss the importance of the protocols often mask an unwillingness to apply time-tested rules and principles to contemporary armed conflicts. Our experience shows that the failure to impose limits on means and methods of warfare may prompt excesses in return and contribute to continuing cycles of conflict that will spiral through generations. As a result, the ICRC remains convinced that the fundamental challenge facing us today is not the relevance of existing rules, but rather improving the implementation of these rules. In this spirit, the ICRC and Switzerland are jointly facilitating a process with states aimed at strengthening respect for humanitarian law, which Jonathan will refer to as well. More generally, it is critical that states parties take the measures necessary to implement the protocols at the domestic level to give full effect to their obligations under these. Finally, as knowledge is a prerequisite for improving respect for IHL, the continued dissemination of the law and the training of armed forces remain important. Although achieving greater respect for the protocols is crucial, this does not mean that there is no scope for further clarification or development. For example, despite the existence of rules pertaining to non-international armed conflicts, there is still a disparity between the rules governing these situations as compared to international armed conflicts, for instance, with regard to the deprivation of liberty. Furthermore, difficulties remain in the application of the law, in particular in response to new threats, actors, and means and methods of warfare. Notably, debates continue on the interpretation of certain key legal concepts for the protection of civilians and civilian objects, such as the principle of proportionality. As a result, it is necessary to continue reflecting on these and on other issues in order to reaffirm, clarify, or develop international humanitarian law where needed. In closing, I wish to leave you with a final observation. As we have heard at the beginning, the geopolitical context in which the protocols were negotiated was not an easy one, but states worked hard to reaffirm, clarify, and develop humanitarian law. It is crucial to remember this as we reflect on the continued relevance of the protocols. Indeed, they, and the body of law they contributed to, are not the product of humanitarian idealism. They strike a balance between military necessity and humanity. Furthermore, they are not relics of a bygone, simpler time in history. Rather, they are carefully negotiated products of experience and hard-won compromise, based on the complexities of combat, and they remain very much relevant today. So we ask states three things. First, please adhere to the additional protocols if you have not done so already. Second, please work to fully implement, apply, and enforce them. And third, please speak up for the protocols, for their very practical relevance to today's armed conflicts, and for the humanitarian impact they have on people affected by these every day. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Helen. You've mentioned the words implementation, dissemination, clarification. So we are at the heart of the subject of this discussion on generating respect for the law. So thanks for this call at the end of your presentation. Now I'd like to turn to you to discuss about how to make the protocols alive, because we know that for the protocols to work, they need to come alive, and need to come alive in the minds of those who apply it. So Frank, can you tell us more about this military perspective on the additional protocols?
Thanks, Vincent. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Just one brief disclaimer. I think it will become pretty clear pretty quickly. I don't speak on behalf of the Royal Air Force or any other British state authority. It's quite interesting the way this is developed. Eve has dealt with this, what the military would call the strategic level, the political level. Helen has looked at the operational level, how the protocols were brought into force and how they may go forward. What I would like to do today is to bring you down to the tactical level, what happens on the ground. So in order to do that, I would like to take you to a recent conflict conducted by a state party to the protocols, and one particular participant, a friend of mine. Let's call him Ed. It's not his real name. Ed is leader of 28 men. He is an infantry officer. Each of them weighed down by 20 or 30 kilos of kit, but at their command, a full panoply of firepower. And they're on patrol in an operational area. They come under fire, effective enemy fire as they call it. In other words, they're shot at, and they're pinned down, and they've got a problem. Now bear in mind that these 28 people know each other extremely well. They're very close friends. They've been together for years and years. They know each other intimately. Over the last few weeks and months, 2 of them have been killed and another 3 very seriously injured. They have a real problem. At Ed's command, initially, is artillery in the form of mortars or guns. Above that, helicopters. If necessary, jets are available to come in and bomb the target, which happens to be a compound, what they call a compound in this area, actually a house, a family house. So Ed is faced with a dilemma. And we'll come to what Ed does towards the end of my talk. But the considerations he applies now are not the considerations that would have applied before the additional protocols were promulgated and ratified. Because whilst he may not know the intricacies of Article 51 or 57 of the first protocol, or any of the second, he's internalized those principles. Now, whether he chooses to comply with them is a different matter, and I'll come back to that. But there's a spectrum of approaches that Ed or people like him can take. And I'd like to look at that spectrum through the lens of 2 particular operational units, very active in most operational countries, states parties, and especially otherwise, non-states parties right now. Both of them controversial and representing different ends of the spectrum. The first are the real professionals, the true warriors, the elite, the special forces. So let's go back to that combat area where Ed is serving, where Lieutenant Ed is serving. Special forces have been conducting mission. This is not a hypothesis. Special forces have been conducting missions in this area. I'm speaking of Afghanistan, of Iraq, and currently in Syria, and doing so without any transparency whatsoever. The degree to which the protocols or any other customary or non-customary provisions of IHL are applied are opaque. But the culture that these people adopt is not opaque. It's a getting things done culture. It's a culture where, and there are exceptions, the law is seen as an obstacle, as something to get over, rather than an enabler. This has resulted in both tactical mayhem in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and operational disaster and failure, for reasons we can go into if anyone's interested. So that's at one end of the spectrum, the real professionals. And I'm going to use that word again in a different context in a few minutes. And then at the other end of the spectrum, and I'm speaking here of a force I know quite well. And you may think this counterintuitive, and you may be quite surprised as to who I'm going to talk about at the other end of the spectrum. Those who regard IHL as an enabler, and the protocols and their targeting provisions as enablers, as assistants to what they do. And I'm talking about a young unit that is lethally engaged every day, and including today, in this case against IS, and causing heavy casualties. And that's the UAV program, the Unmanned Aerial Vehicle program. And I'm speaking here because I only have familiarity with the British. It is remarkable how a culture of compliance has been embedded in that unit. Speaking to their members, it is humbling the degree to which real professionalism is applied by them. There's a relentless adherence enforced by peer pressure, enforced also from above by extensive oversight. A relentless adherence to IHL or LOAC, the law of armed conflict as they call it. One person I spoke to recently said if there's any doubt at all, it's the presence of those not directly involved, we don't strike, no matter what the target. Now, there are exceptions, as you know, that can be made to that. But the point here is there's a culture of compliance present there. Now, the real challenge in that particular outfit, that particular unit, is to sustain that. And that requires identifying why they have that culture. And perhaps some elements of the so-called special forces, some elements, at some times, most certainly do not. So the eyes in the sky are open, as it were, to LOAC and to the protocols, but those closest perhaps to the ground are not. Both of these types of unit, both lethally engaged, are subject to the same rules, to the same provisions, as you all know. Well, what are the differences? What makes one see IHL as an obstacle and the other as an enabler? And we're looking at that now. There's no answer I can give in a matter of 30 seconds or so, the 2 minutes I have left. But I offer a couple of ideas. And that's the difference between a warrior culture and a professional culture. And some of you may know there's been extensive literature on this, and there's nothing new about this assessment. But inculcating a professional culture, where as part of your formation, IHL is not seen as something extra, but as integral to what you do, is absolutely crucial to the way the protocols may go and should go forward. I'll come back now to Lieutenant Ed and his approach and what he did on that and many other occasions in southern Afghanistan in 2010. His platoon had taken heavy casualties over the months they were there, possibly one of the heaviest casualties of any unit engaged at that time. I asked him, how often did you call in airstrikes? He said, well, once, a couple of times maybe. I said, why? He said, because when I got into a situation such as the one I described at the outset, I took the view if I couldn't identify my target, if I couldn't get my sniper in his terms, to see what's going on, I don't want to take the risk of killing people who should not be killed. He's now a colonel. He's promoted. He survived the war. And he told me recently that somebody had asked him how many people he'd killed. He's now a relatively senior officer. He said, I haven't killed anybody. It's not my job to kill people. My job is to be a manager of violence. He sees his profession as engaged very intimately closely with the implementation of the rules that he sees as professional, basic rules of professional conduct. My time is up. Thank you very much indeed. And I'd be very happy to engage with any questions later on. Thank you.
I'm convinced that there will be many questions because it raised so many questions, and very interesting presentation on how the additional protocols make a difference. This idea of manager of violence is also very interesting to explore. I wish also people would say how many people you didn't kill by doing this, by respecting the law. This is also one of our big challenges when we talk about the law, when we want to promote respect, to show how the law can save lives and can be actually making a difference for so many people.
And operationally effective and productive as well, Vincent.
So that's something to which we need to come back later on. The effectiveness also of respecting the law. But we will first listen to Jonathan. We'll speak with the state perspective. Most recently, we've seen that the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission was asked to conduct a first inquiry. So that was seen as a an important development. We've seen also lots of progress in the ratification. Hélène mentioned all the ratifications which followed 1977. So from your perspective, tell us about these achievements and also what remains to be done.
Thank you, Vincent, and thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be with you for the 40 years of the APs. I must confess that on my side, I hope that life begins before 40, and to have the legitimacy to be here. Let me just begin with the disclaimer, and thank you for that, but that's something also important for us to distinguish the role of Switzerland as the depository state and as a state party, even if it's something sometimes a bit artificial. It's very important to make this distinction. We are also speaking about the two first additional protocols, APs of 1977, but do not forget about the third one that has been adopted in 2005, but for obvious reasons, this protocol is not the focus of this discussion today. And just for the lawyers in the room, I will sometimes refer to ratification, even if the technical term is accession for state having already signed the APs. So now, 40 years ago, exactly day to day, Switzerland has invited or gathered this diplomatic conference on the reaffirmation and development of IHL applicable in armed conflicts. 124 states gathered at this diplomatic conference. And I must concur with all the previous panelists that after 40 years after the adoption of these protocols, they remain as relevant as the time of their adoption. And on this issue, Switzerland is very much convinced that we need to better implement rules rather to adopt new rules. We have seen maybe some areas where the law is still developing, like the weapons issues, the fight against impunity. We also will have the possibility or the opportunity to see next week the conference or the negotiation on the weapon on a nuclear weapon treaty. But for the core of IHL, we now very much work on this, on its implementation, and that's something states have kind of agreed during the last or the previous international conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in 2015. So that's something also important to keep in mind. But however, IHL is still increasingly challenged in the contemporary conflicts. We also hear a lot of erosion of IHL. It has became fashionable to speak about erosion, and I think that's may contain some risks for its credibility and the willingness of parties to the conflicts to respect IHL. So with that in mind, I think, and that's very much about the idea of the generating respect for IHL conferences and the cycle you organized. The idea and the challenge is to create kind of an environment conducive to respect of IHL. And in this respect, Switzerland and the ICRC are currently facilitating an intergovernmental process on strengthening respect to IHL. Hélène has just said a few words on it. Let me just develop a bit on this process. The first phase was during between the 31st international conference and the 32nd. So that was between 2011 and 2015. It has become clear during this phase of the consultation process that the GCs, the Geneva Conventions, and the additional protocols are quite an exception in the galaxy of multilateral treaties, in that states do not have concretely the possibility to meet on a regular basis to speak about the implementation of IHL. So now, based on the mandate of the 32nd conference of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, we are a bit revisiting this idea, and we have kind of three component mandates which have to be seen as complementary. We are revisiting the idea of a forum of states for IHL and how the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent and regional forums can be better used to enhance implementation of IHL. Now the result of this discussion will be submitted in the next international conference taking place in 2019, and I would like to invite states here to engage in this process and to share their views. That will be very important in this phase. Now, in addition, we have also we are actually co-chairing with the ICRC, the Montreux Document Forum. The third plenary of this forum was held in late April this year, and it's quite interesting. It's about the Montreux Document on private military and security companies, which has been launched in 2006 and adopted in 2008, launched by the ICRC in Switzerland, but with some states particularly concerned. And now it's interesting to see this forum being used by member states or states and organizations supporting the Montreux document as a platform where you can meet and just exchange on good practices on the challenges you face with regard to the implementation of your obligations as a state relating to the activities of these companies. On a parallel basis, and now I will turn to the APs, we also, Switzerland as a state party, call parties to conflict to respect IHL, is it in multilateral context or in bilateral discussion, and of course states to ratify IHL treaties. So we would also like to seize this opportunity of the 40 years anniversary to do so. Let me just give you also a bit of background on the APs. They have been adopted in 77, as we have said, and they entered into force in 78, 6 months after the second instrument of accession has been deposited by Libya. And it is interesting to note that similarly to the Geneva Conventions, the APs provide that they entered into force after 2 instruments only of ratifications or accession have been deposited. And that was a clause proposed by the ICRC with the aim to render the APs quickly applicable, at least between state parties, and to accelerate also the rate of ratifications. And we can see in both protocols that there is an article speaking of the formulation shall be ratified as soon as possible, which is a pressing recommendation to states. Now, one of the biggest success, as Professor Sando also mentioned, is that the negotiation was universal. And that's something very, very important. So all the parties to the Geneva Conventions, all member states to the UN were invited to participate to this negotiation. This may also explain, among other reasons, why it took 4 years to negotiate the APs and only 4 months to negotiate the Geneva Conventions. And telling me also the text, the authentic text of the Geneva Conventions were English and French, and for the APs we have English, Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, French, and Russian, and that's something. I mean, to create a greater sense of ownership of IHL, that was very, very important. So now, as it has already been said, even if the APs are among the multilateral treaties, I mean, the most widely ratified in this area, they are still not universally ratified. In 90, we had 96 states parties to AP1 and 86 to AP2. 5 years later, we had, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, we had 146 states for AP1 and 133 for AP2. And now we have, as Hélène has mentioned, 174 and 168. So if we have a look at how many states party to the conventions, the Geneva Conventions, are parties to the APs. We have 85%, more than 85% of state party to the GCs that are also parties to AP1 and 2. In other words, it means that we have 22 parties to the Geneva Conventions that are not parties to AP1 and 28 to AP2. There is the map actually on the, which is very small, you're right. So let's just have a look at it very, very quickly. You have mainly the Asia region, which is a bit less represented in the APs than the other one. We have also a number of states having ratified AP1, but not 2. So some of them are also considering the idea of ratifying AP2. And I think, yeah, I can conclude with three ideas. I think states can seize this opportunity of the 40th anniversary of the APs to ask themselves three things. For the first, all non-ratifying states parties to AP1 or 2 should ask themselves if the reasons why they do not have done so until now are still relevant. We have listened to Professor Sando. I think we are in a context very different now, 40 years after the adoption of this protocol. So ask ourselves this question. We have, in this respect, sent to all the Swiss embassies accredited in states concerned a démarche on Tuesday to encourage states to join the APs. We have also seen room for optimism on this ratification call. The number of national IHL commissions is increasing continuously. We have now 108 national commissions, some of them representing states which have not yet ratified the APs. So that's the first. And then we have also, I had a look at the report of the ICRC presented to the 32nd conference in 2015. And during the period of 2011 and 2015, 121 states have become party to 26 IHL treaties. So that's very interesting. Second, for states already parties to AP1, if they do not have done so, they should consider to recognize the IHFFC. Indeed, the first mandate has been tasked by the OSCE a few days ago, and for the states and maybe also important, I'm abusing numbers, but it's important to say that out of 174 states parties to AP1, only 76 have recognized the competence of the IHFFC, the Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. And to finish, let me just mention also the fact that state parties may consider to withdraw reservation, even if it's a tool also to push for universalization. Some states already parties to APs have ratified them thanks to the tool of reservation, but ask ourselves also this question. And for the community of states parties to AP1 and 2, let me ask you to use all the tools available to push the universalization. We can also think about the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review System of the Human Rights Council. Let's make use of these tools to push for universalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's good you gave figures. It's good we can look at the map, and it's good we can measure the progress. And I think we need also to be specific in this discussion, because we aim at developing awareness for the law. You mentioned dissemination through also military instruction. You mentioned how the military culture can be properly changed through inculcation of of the law, and also through the actions of states which can recommit to IHL, which can also further ratify treaties and develop their adherence to the law. So in this room we have many people who are working actively on this. Now it's time for you to ask questions.
The mercenary is more and more present. The United States, which has employed, we think, several 100,000 of these people since the war on terror, counts them as non-state actors and says they're responsible for nothing. And yet they are both the warrior culture, if ever there were one, and at the same time they are supposed to be the professionals par excellence. And now we have Mr. Eric Prince, whom you know was the founder of Blackwater, who is pontificating from the United Arab Emirates, talking about how we must go in and lay waste to a great deal of the region, particularly Iran now, and he's proposing, of course, huge amounts of mercenaries if the people involved can't come up with the troops necessary. So how do you conciliate then the warrior culture and this professional compliance attitude in the mercenaries, particularly given the importance of mercenaries in the region that you alluded to, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, etc.? And also the very question of the non-state actors.
Thank you for organizing this panel today, because I think, yes, a few of us were there, and actually, yes, the human factor. I would like to say that Pierre Graber, for example, the federal councillor who was chairing this conference, played a very important role. And precisely, he was not a lawyer, but he was a very powerful chair of this conference, and he pushed this conference into achieving this result. Then definitely you mentioned George Aldrich, Ahmed Sultan from Egypt, Wahib Abada from Algeria, David Miller from Canada, and George Abissab and so on. But clearly, I think, yes, the human factor, and after that, the human factor, you had a network of lawyers working on behalf of the protocols. And some of them are still alive, I must say, thank God. And after that, I must say, clearly, I was very, very grateful that you mentioned the role of Sanremo, because precisely there was a formal negotiation here in Geneva and an informal negotiation in Sanremo. And clearly, we needed both. We needed both. And Sanremo, actually, and I want to invite everyone here, from the 7th to the 9th of September, jointly with the ICRC, the International Institute of Humanitarian Law is organizing a roundtable on precisely the additional protocols 40 years later, new conflicts, new actors, new perspectives. And I think it's very important that we go on with this discussion in Sanremo. We go on because it's not enough to, as you know, to access, adhere, to ratify, but we need also discussions, we need also training, and actually we are very happy in Sanremo to have a British officer seconded as director of the military courses. So my question is, how do you see the new perspectives of those protocols?
My name's Nicole. I'm from the Australian mission, but I'm attending in my personal capacity. So I wrote my honours basically on everything that Frank covered in his speech. And I just have a few questions, because it's not often that I get to speak to someone who's actually involved in the tactical implementation of IHL. So my question concerns Article 51 in API 1, and I know that probably everyone knows what it means, but I'll repeat it for the benefit. The principle of proportionality prohibits attacks which causes the loss of civilian life, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. But my problem is that there's military commanders and military academics who are saying that on the battlefield, and Frank, you're more than welcome to correct me if I'm wrong, and this might be in more of a US context, but commanders are making decisions based on the risk of harm to their soldiers rather than the collateral damage that will ensue or the impacts it will have on civilians. And then now we have these new types of weapons like drones and precise technology which completely eliminate all the risk to soldiers, and they're just encouraging commanders to carry out more frequent attacks. And we know that's a trend that's happening. So we have states now making targeting decisions that remove the risk to the soldiers, so there's more and more of these attacks being carried out, and we're seeing the focus of these targeting decisions shifting from the quantum of incidental loss and collateral damage to the actual advantages which will be gained in an attack. And this is just being made easier by the growing asymmetry of warfare, like we all know. And so my problem with this is that in API, in Article 51, there's no shared understanding and there's no common concrete definition of what is clearly excessive, of what is excessive. It remains a subjective value judgment that's made by a military commander on the battlefield. And that's, in all honesty, that's okay, but we're seeing such a negative impact on civilians. And like, for example, I'll just throw out some figures in Pakistan. Between the years 2003 to 2014, the US drone program only had a 21% successful strike rate. 21%. So my question to you is, in your opinion, does the modern battlefield and this growing trend in warfare mean that commanders are more inclined to give more weight to the anticipated advantages of an attack rather than collateral damage? And is this being enabled by a legal framework which is silent on the impact of the modern battlefield and these new precise weapons on IHL? Thank you.
Thank you. So would like to take the first one. I think maybe it's for Frank. I think it was addressed to you.
Okay, so first question there. I was a barrister for 7 years, criminal advocate, criminal defense and prosecution advocate. And I had a lot of clients who said they were professional criminals. I would suggest that's a category error, that criminals are not professional any more than these mercenaries are professional. To me, doctors, nurses, accountants, lawyers, and soldiers are professionals insofar as they comply with the rules that apply to their profession. That's what makes them professionals. Being paid killers or extremely well-paid consultants does not render you professional any more than being a particularly good safe breaker or robber renders you professional. Forgive me, I don't mean to be flippant, but I think it's an important distinction to make between calling yourself professional and actually being professional. Nicole, concerning your question, may I move to Nicole's question? Yeah. And it may well be that Eve or one of the others want to come in on this, on how this was originally drafted. As I recall it, that's a very old formulation. Eve, I don't know if you can comment that the formulation Article 51 goes right back into the 20s. Yeah. Now, the negotiations and the purpose, I don't know, but concerning the application today, first point, concerning Pakistan, very interesting. Remember that the Pakistan drone missions, UAV, drone, whatever you want to call them, APAs, are carried out by the CIA, who are not professional military actors in any sense of the term, for various reasons. But and I know you're aware of that, but to deal with the question directly, it really depends on, you're right, it depends on the individual and it depends on the ethos that attaches to the unit. And the difference between, I think that can be well illustrated in the difference between the Pakistani UAV drone units, mostly operated by the CIA and special operations, or whatever they call it. And I'm not blowing the trumpet here for the British. I really am. I'm extremely critical of British military operations and our incompetent defeats over the last few years, well deserved. But the UAV units that have an entirely different approach. So in the cases you describe, the weight would involve civilian casualties as against the gain to be applied by eliminating the target. That's how they would look at it, I think. Now, I'm not an operational lawyer, I never have been, but I understand that's the way they look at it, and as a result, very many missions are aborted or cancelled for that purpose. As to other units, particularly the US Air Force, let alone other countries' units, I can't comment because I don't have the depth of knowledge on that.
There is this question, a very open question that Michel raised about the perspectives of the additional protocols. Would you like to comment? Any of you? Hélène, do you want to take this one?
New perspectives for the protocols. I mean, Vincent actually was mentioning that maybe one of the questions at the end would be, where do you see the protocols in 10 years? I guess this relates a bit to your question. And I mean, I guess in general terms, it's important, and it goes back to some of the messages we've heard and that I've already mentioned as well, to the need to ratify, to ensure universal ratification in the first place, but also, and more importantly than ratification, implementation and greater respect for the law. And there, I think the role of dissemination is really critical, but also recalling that it's not only parties to armed conflicts that need to respect the law, also other states, parties can work to ensure respect by by parties to armed conflicts. And I think this is also something that can be further looked at in terms of increasing respect for humanitarian law. But also not forgetting that there are new realities. Whether these fit within the protocols or not is something that needs to be looked at on a continuous basis to ensure that the law remains pertinent and to reaffirm, clarify, or develop as needed throughout the years. So I think it's not about saying, the law is always enough. I think it's important to always look at it and look at it based on new realities to see where it needs to go. So it's a bit of a general response, but I think those are the big lines of where I think we need to look at in the next 10 years or longer.
I'm Alexander Bosych, and at this time I would speak as a citizen of Soviet Union. I'm referring to title of conference, respect, law, etc., and the basics. So I wonder how appropriate is to use in this auditorium, as it's usually in Switzerland, title communist regime towards the Soviet Union. How appropriate it's to use it to the country which is a founder of United Nations and a treaty which signed this protocol as a country. Why don't we use, considering these colonial matters which were discussed here, I never heard Britain or Commonwealth called colonial regime in this auditorium. I never heard United States called capitalist or imperialist regime. I never heard even China now called communist regime. If one puts such a disrespect, then what we can to the party which was one of the basical in this treaty, what can we discuss concerning the rest of the law? There was no communist regime signature in these protocols, I believe. And we know that in Europe now, which is trying to advocate fascism, which was widely collaborating, invading Soviet Union, they're trying to put equality between fascism and communism. But as Russian Minister of Culture correctly pointed, the humanity returned to Europe in 1945 with the Soviet army.
Thank you. I think your point is well taken. I think in the context of this discussion, maybe it was used, I don't recall, but it could have been used, but I don't think it had a political meaning, but in a sense of beyond the historical meaning that we wanted to give to the discussion. But your point is well taken, and I think it's a valid point. So thank you for making that. We need to be careful of the. Okay, we need to take that into account. Thank you. But at the same time, that's not the main purpose of our discussion. But we need to take care of the way we present, including on historical facts. So one more and last question there.
My name is Quentin Blanchett. I'm currently volunteering at the Mexican Red Cross. It's not obvious right now, but I'm just here for a few weeks. And the other night, it was already too late to study or read about IHL. So I figured I would watch a movie. And pardon me if my question will sound trivial to you, but that movie was from a famous online platform. And it's called War Machine. I don't know if you've heard about it or, yeah, all right. And there's a scene in that movie where a young private from the US military is kind of confused and asks General McMahon, I've heard they give medals for, correct me if I'm wrong, courageous restraint. And the soldier sees the general and he looks confused and he says I don't know what that means, I don't get the point of that. Could you explain me what it is? And from what I understood is we congratulate you for not using your weapon in a situation where it was really difficult, it was really hard to make that decision. And it just got me thinking of, is that something that's let's say that's available, not available, but is that something that's part of every armies, or is it just the US military? Maybe in the British Armed Forces you also have those medals, and if you could tell me more about it. Thank you.
No, just on the communist, I don't understand we can discuss afterwards. I don't understand your question because I don't have heard anyone speak of communist regime, and I can tell you that in the conference, in diplomatic conference, Professor Plishenko, for example, of USSR, was very active and very important in the negotiation. I can just say that. Maybe we can discuss that later on. Now, just one word on the principle of proportionality. I think it's, of course, a very difficult principle. It's a compromise with the military. Humanitarian law cannot stop military to win the war. Right? That's the balance. What is important, and discussion was important here, is not to have this principle only at a very strategic level. For example, to tell, okay, Hiroshima and Nagasaki is proportionate with the end of the war. Something like that, it's a straight. And it's not that. Principle of proportionality is really also a field level. And for example, if two soldiers go in a school, you cannot destroy the school. That's the principle of proportionality. So it must remain also on the ground and not just be envisaged on a very high strategic level. And last word on the future of the protocol. I think what is important in 10 years to keep up the basic principle of those protocols. And to keep up Protocol 2. I am not sure that nowadays states would accept even Article 3, honestly speaking. I'm not very optimistic. And to keep up those principles, what else? It's the question of respect, dignity of every human being, a certain compassion for those who suffer, and, as I mentioned with relief action, solidarity. And those principles are essential not only in war, but even in time of peace. And now, in time of peace, I'm not sure that those principles are respected. So the essential effort, I think, for the future is to defend and how to defend those basic principles of the protocol.
Okay, concerning courageous restraint, the film you're addressing, War Machine, is essentially a word-for-word transcription of an article, or a book, I should say, I exaggerate for dramatic effect, by Michael Hastings called The Operators. And it documented General McChrystal's travels, as you probably know, in Afghanistan at the time. And the incident you describe crystallized the difficulty of courageous restraint. And in the real incident, and this happened many, many hundreds of times, I think, over the last few years of that benighted campaign. What McChrystal said to the young Marine, in fact, I think it was an army soldier in the book, was, "Son, that's your job. That's life in a green suit. You're a professional, and this is the one chance we have of success." Now, that didn't go down well in some quarters. I know of one British officer who had described this anonymously, bravely enough, as outrageous restraint, and that person did not deserve his rank. I hope that addresses, if not answers, your question. But there is a culture of that. It's not uniformly adopted, and it's very controversial.
So now I think it's time to come to the conclusion to this very interesting panel. I don't want to frustrate anyone, so you may want to have your last word as well and speak about the additional protocols at 50 when we meet in 10 years' time. and the achievements we want to see in the development of these two. Frank, you may want to say also a word about military effectiveness, but that would be the concluding remark. So each of you can have 1 minute to say what you would like to see when we meet again in 10 years' time, in terms of development of the additional protocols.
Oh, my first hope would be that we don't need the protocol, finally. And I think we are not strong enough on the use ad bellum nowadays. We are tolerant with the use of force. And certainly we have to fight hard for that, because I don't think the world nowadays can afford to have still many armed conflicts. So that's well, very generally speaking. On the rest, I would, just as I mentioned, hope that at least we keep up the essence of those protocols when we have armed conflict, which is far from being the case nowadays. Huh? So to have the protocol well implemented in 10 years would be a great success, I would say, already. It's 1 minute.
I will be even shorter than 1 minute, because I think Professor Sandeau just said and repeated also what I said before. So I think implementation is critical, universal ratification, greater respect, essentially, for IHL.
Thank you. Would like to add something? Yes?
I have to echo Helen, actually, greater respect. It's the final word. I'm not as optimistic as Professor Sandeau, so I guess in 10 years or more, we'll still need the APs. So the message was a bit more universalization or more participation in the APs, better implementation. And one very important point which has been made by Mr. Voete is the regularity of these contacts, especially in cities like Geneva, where diplomats move every four years. I think it's very important to meet in formal fora, but also in informal fora. We push some ideas in informal fora to have them in the formal fora. So yeah, I would like also to echo these words.
One point, if I might, on the question of 10 years, how we see things in 10 years. For my part, it would be great to see the APs and indeed IHL as a whole taken out of, and I don't say this flippantly, out of the hand of lawyers and placed into mainstreamed into officers' training. Second thing, concerning efficacy, which it isn't now, by the way, in very many armies, IHL and LOAC is seen as something to get out of the way and to do every year with a video. Okay, secondly, concerning efficacy, 30 seconds on that. What Vietnam had was My Lai. We had, the British had Baha Musa, a particular case involving a beating and killing in Iraq. It seriously damaged the overall mission. Haditha, similar thing for the Americans, several murders by a poorly led unit. All these units have one thing in common, they're poorly led by people with no regard for IHL. And above all, Abu Ghraib, mentioned by one American general rightly as the greatest strategic defeat we had. Res ipsa loquitur, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all.